This is Transport BT, a podcast of BT correspondents.
Welcome to Transport BT, a podcast of BT correspondents. I'm your host, correspondent Derryn Wong. Every week, my colleagues and I break down a business story that matters. So today we're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, COEs. In June, our newly minted acting Transport Minister Jeffrey Siow was giving his first big interview to the media, and he said, firstly, that PHCs don't actually drive up COE prices, and secondly, it's better to give a COE to a private hire car since it's more useful to Singapore as a whole. Now, the response was, predictably, a lot of unhappy comments online, but at Transport BT, we're going to take a measured look at those statements firstly, and then we're going to look at what are the possibility of changes to the COE system, which the minister also talked about. If we can design a better COE system, what would it look like? What would the priorities be? And to discuss all of that with us today is someone who knows the system very, very well. We have Walter Theseira, Associate Professor of Economics at Singapore University of Social Sciences. Welcome to the show, Walter.
Good to be here.
I'm sure a lot of people will recognize your name, but for those who don't, tell us a bit more about your background and your expertise.
So I'm an economist at the Singapore University of Social Sciences, and I've been working one way or another on transport issues in Singapore for about a decade plus. Some of these with LTA. I've done some studies with them looking at public transport behavior, also looking at COE auctions, and I've also done some work independently with some international organizations because everybody's actually very interested in how we run our transport policy, especially cars in Singapore.
I mean, Singapore was one of the first places in the world to introduce road pricing, for example, right? And a lot of countries took that as a model, didn't they?
That's exactly right. Singapore is one of the first to do road pricing, to do additional taxes on cars, to do controls of cars like COE. And, the thing is, a lot of people say we would like to do what you're doing in Singapore in order to control our congestion problems, but we can't, right? We cannot because we would get killed politically or one way or another.
Exactly.
So that's most of the issue, right?
That makes Singapore the interesting case study, infamous. Getting back to the COEs, let's see what Acting Minister Siow said about private hire cars. Let me quote him here. Many people who have chosen not to buy a car, it's because now we have private hire cars. I think if we didn't have PHCs today, actually the reverse would be true, that a large number of these people will feel that I think I need to buy a car and therefore they will bid the price of the COE up. So what do you think of that? Is that an accurate statement?
So I think if you look at the system as a whole, transport as a whole in Singapore, I think he's absolutely right. Basically, hired cars, taxis, private hire cars, they fulfill this very important role of actually soaking up demand for private cars. If we didn't have them, a lot more people would want to buy private cars in Singapore. The same is true anywhere you look in the world. In any well-functioning major city, you have a pretty robust layer of private transport options available. Taxis, private hire cars. Of course, I think the most important thing is actually public transport, but that's at the system level. I think when you get down to the experience of the individual car buyer in Singapore, then things get a lot more messy. Because, as an individual car buyer, you're not thinking about the system. You're thinking, okay, I'm going into a COE auction, I'm buying a car. Why the heck is that guy who is, from a car company bidding against me for this car? This is outrageous, it's unfair, right? So I think that's really the issue.
You could say that about anything in public policy, actually. I mean, there's always the system level and there's always the individual emotional level as well. So let's talk about the other thing the acting minister talked about, allocation. So he said, if there is one COE left to allocate, is it better to give it to a private car owner who then drives it maybe 2 trips a day and leaves it in the garage? Or is it better to share the car amongst a much larger group of Singaporeans who can have access to the use of a car when they need it? Surely it must be the latter, right? He's using a utilitarian philosophy, right? The greatest good for the greatest number of people. But there obviously has to be some other considerations, right?
The problem is when we're allocating the COEs, we're doing it using prices. And so we're making this equation between utility or value to society and how much you're willing to pay. And we're kind of saying, look, if we're willing to pay more for it, then somehow it's got more value to society. And that's the way it's going to be, right? And I think once you get down to that, then you realize actually you have a lot of outcomes which don't sound so good. So for example, if you have somebody who's very rich, they want to burn a lot of money in the COE and they want to attach it to a shiny Rolls Royce and park it in the garage and do nothing of it. Is that really good for society? So then what's the moral justification for the system then? And I think the moral justification must be that at the end of the day, we are doing something productive with the money we're collecting from the COE system, right? Better public transport, subsidizing it, whatever we want to spend the money on it for a public purpose. But there, I think we run into the challenge that the government, for a variety of reasons, does not want to link one source of money or revenue with a particular purpose. They don't want to, for example, say, look, we're going to throw all of the money for COEs into the public transport fund or to subsidize public transport or whatever, right? In practice, they may do that. They can do that. They do it, but they just don't want to have this one-to-one link. And because they don't want to, then I think it unfortunately opens up the COE system and the money collected to a lot of criticisms, right? But in reality, of course, it does actually support all of the public expenditures in Singapore.
In 2024, the government collected about $6.5 billion in COE revenue. And of course, we also had a $6.4 billion surplus. So that tells you how important the COE system is in that sense. Like you said just now, I think the problem is it comes in when people see that, hey, I'm just an average Joe and I'm bidding against a company with huge pockets and they already kind of took out taxes from the equation last time and now they're not doing this now. So do you think that sense of injustice is justified?
Okay, I think what people object to is not so much, I think, profit, right? Because look, most of us Singaporeans were working in profit-making companies. That's where the money to feed our family comes from, right? Your salaries are paid. So I think profit is not the issue. I think what people maybe are a bit more concerned about is high fares give the companies additional money to pay high COE prices. And then high COE prices mean that the fares need to go up. And then this really terrible vicious cycle is going on and on, right?
That's right, yeah.
And is that a legit worry, right? Is it a fair thing to be worried about? That's where we come back to the problem that at the end of the day, we have a scarce resource, which is a COE,
yes,
right? We don't have an unlimited number to allocate. And we've decided to allocate it by price. And once you've decided to allocate something scarce by price, basically, the price is whatever is necessary to clear the market. That's the problem. The only way to get out of that problem is to ask ourselves, is there something which is a better alternative to just using COEs or prices outright, to allocate?
Which we're going to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk about it later. So I think we really have to get to that issue,
Now, when we come back, let's dream up a wholly different COE system or maybe something else entirely.
Breaking news from the Business Times podcast team.
Hi guys, this is Emily Liu, your host of Market Focus Daily. I've got some great news. Come July, Market Focus is getting bigger. I'll be bringing in market and investment experts into the studio to share analysis and opinions on what moved the markets and what to look out for in the week ahead. Every Friday, starting on July 4th.
Look out for Market Focus Weekly from the Business Times or wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, back to Transport BT, a podcast of BT correspondents.
Okay, we're here on Transport BT talking to Walter Theseira, Associate Professor of Economics at SUSS. Now, we just discussed what Acting Minister Jeffrey Siow talked about with COEs and private hire cars, which kicked up a lot of reactions online. And I found another thing he said in his first big media interview interesting as well. He didn't give much detail, but he did say again, in the long term, Singapore could review the COE system as a way of allocating vehicles. So also over the years, people have come up with many different ideas on how to improve the COE system. But let's start. What actually does it do? It controls the population by limiting ownership, right?
Let's look at what the COE system is really designed to do. It's really designed to try to control congestion in Singapore and make our traffic flow more efficiently. It's not about the population, it's about congestion. That said, when we look at why people don't like the system, what they want to do about it, maybe I can kind of categorize it into two broad classes of arguments. There's one class of arguments, which is that people agree that we need to do something about congestion. What they disagree with is COE is not the best way of doing it, okay? So it's an agreement on the objective, but it's not an agreement on the method. The other, I think, set of arguments have to do with questioning the legitimacy of targeting congestion in the first instance. That argument is more like the government should be spending money, building more roads, doing more to subsidize public transport. But then if you want to drive a car, you take your chances, you see what happens. I think that argument actually is more of a minority view in Singapore. And I think the reason why it's more of a minority view is that Singaporeans are well-traveled. And any Singaporean who's been to KL, Jakarta, Bangkok will be like, yeah, do we really want that? Maybe not,
I think my criticism is that we've gone, 30 years plus without any major changes. COE introduced in 1990. Even the idea of car ownership has changed totally. You got rentals, you got short-term rentals, you got people driving the car halfway and being a taxi, PHCs the other time. So how do we update the system to address today's needs?
The problem is, when the system was first designed, we never really asked the question, how many vehicles should we have in Singapore and of what type? We didn't ask that question. What we actually did when we designed the system is we looked at the vehicle stock in Singapore that existed, at the time the system came in place, and we grandfathered the vehicle stock. We said, okay, whatever people have decided to buy and own as of this date, okay, you can continue to hold your vehicles, and when they do expire, we're just going to replace them one for one with the COE system. And we also said on top of that, we're going to implement a growth factor for the various types of vehicles in Singapore, and we're just going to assume that if we tweak this growth factor a bit, we can somehow keep on going in Singapore with the right mix of vehicles.
And that obviously didn't work out, right?
Yeah, it's not ideal, because the way that we've used our vehicles in Singapore has changed so much over the years. I mean, you talked a bit about things like private hire vehicles, which didn't even exist 30 years ago, right? That category, it was just taxis. Even if you look at goods vehicles and logistics, completely different. Nobody would have said in 1990, we would have this massive thing called e-commerce, which leads to, much more demand for basically urban logistics than existed in the past. So that's why I think we have to go back to the fundamentals and ask ourselves, how much confidence do we have that we have the right categorizations of COEs, the right numbers in the different categories, the right assumptions about how those vehicles be used on the road? Because if we're not sure about this, we don't have the right assumptions, maybe we need to relook this and just redesign this from scratch.
No, that's a very good point. You're right. And we have to look at the different categories as well. What would a more equitable or ideal COE system look like to you?
I thought there were two major conceptual shifts or things we want to think about, right? The first issue is, should we actually move away from pricing either in part or completely? And this is actually what a lot of critiques of the COE system have.
How else would you do it without money?
Yeah, exactly. But if we didn't do money, what would it look like, right? Maybe it would look like a system where it's kind of more like HDB. In HDB, we don't just allow anybody to buy a flat, right? We actually give people different priorities depending on your family situation. So family nucleus category, maybe singles category. And then, like it or not, the different categories with the different odds of getting a COE. Have to say again, I'm not a huge fan of that, but I think one could actually more seriously think about it to ask ourselves, is that a good or bad thing to do?
I think most people would like that, but what are the problems that make you hesitant on that?
I think one of the big issues with a non-pricing based system is actually resale. Just like the HDB market, you have to have some control over resale. Otherwise, all of the Singaporeans who get in under the most favored category, they do it whether they could afford a car or not, and they would turn around and resell the car immediately, right?
The HDB resale market.
Exactly, just like the HDB resale market. So we would have to, I think, complicate the matter with minimum ownership periods and things like that, which are a bit, I think, messy for cars.
That is messy, yes.
Yeah, so I think my main concern is the practicality of doing such a system. But, it's something we could always talk more about. The other massive change, and this is the one I'm more keen on, right, thinking about, is removing the problem of the COE supply cycle. Because we own our COE or it's valid for a 10-year period, we have a COE supply cycle where basically whatever you're buying today and registering with COE, it comes back onto the market approximately in 10 years' time. So that would be fine if the COEs were allocated evenly across the 10 years, but they're not. They're not allocated evenly. There are years like now where the COE supply is pretty low, and there are also years which will be coming in the end of the decade where the COE supply is much higher than it is now. And because of that, you have these huge swings in prices, which I think is insane. I think it's insane to have a huge swing where if you buy your car in this year, you pay, twice the amount what somebody else does for the same car, but, they bought it in a different year. Doesn't make any sense. And if you think it's bad for private car owners, what about for businesses? I mean, your profit and loss depends just on when you started business and bought your vehicles.
Now, the industry always says, this boom and bust cycle, there's the hire and fire people. It's very, very bad.
Yeah. To be clear, I don't think this was ever the intention of the government. It's just what we ended up with. So then how do we break it, right? Let's talk about radical options first.
I like this.
I think the most radical option is we just eliminate COEs entirely. Remove COEs, you buy the car as long as you're willing to pay the ARF and so on. But when you use the car, that's when you face, the real bill, right?
So instead of paying a huge amount out of the door to get the car, you might have to pay a huge amount, like a service, right? Like everything is a service almost, every time you drive, you would have to pay a lot. I can't imagine how much that would be, but
if I'm going to drive into the CBD or something, maybe during rush hour, I'm going to bet it's going to be multiples more than it is today. It's going to be much more than it is today.
I think it'll be at least 100 to 100.
Well, I don't know that $100, but I mean, I'm not going to quote any figures here. If we do go to such a system, all of us are going to have to get used to the idea that when we drive out of the parking lot, the meter could start ticking.
No, actually, that's very exciting because hitting it with the price upfront every time, you would have to think about your journeys very carefully.
It would go a long way towards achieving a more theoretically ideal transport system, because most transport experts would actually say the right thing to do is to have charges for using the car which vary by time and place and things like that, Definitely shouldn't be a uniform thing. So I think people don't have to worry that they get charged the same amount in Yishun or Woodlands to drive around as they would in the CBD, right? I mean, it should not be the case logically. So I think that's the most radical one. But I think the problem always is acceptability, because people get really worried that the government or somebody would be monitoring their every drive, and charging them and everything. And they just have no idea what the system would even be like. So I think if we ever did move to such a system, it needs a huge amount of work to prepare the population, just to understand what it's going to be all about and how do we take care of all of the fairness, privacy, and so on concerns. So I think, it's very, very long-term project, I think. Something which is less radical, but also goes partly in that direction, is to actually switch from this 10-year fixed-term COE system to something which is maybe a combination of short-term mileage blocks and time blocks. You have this COE, which lasts a much shorter period of time, or a certain number of miles, whichever one comes first. So maybe it's a couple of years and let's say 50,000 kilometers, 40,000, whatever it is. And basically, you have to get another block when it expires. And in fact, I think in New Zealand, certain classes of road users buy in advance their road tax based on mileage, not based on per year or things like that. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
And what's the advantage of a system? So you might say, why am I giving the government more opportunities to tax me? What I'm going to argue is that if you have a more flexible system that is renewed more frequently, we are no longer stuck with this problem, allocating COEs over 10 years. The idea is that with more continuous release and allocation, ideally pricing is going to be smoothed out. And you no longer have the driver next to me is enjoying to use the car at half the price, just because they bought it in a certain year.
That's true. I've seen the conversation between the guy who bought a COE at low and the guy who bought a COE high, and the amount of misery, the gulf of misery is very, very wide.
Exactly, yeah. And I just want to avoid that. I think it's not good for anybody.
No, that sounds very, very interesting and hopeful. I didn't think when I talk about COE, I might feel hopeful. Usually despair and resignment. That was Walter Theseira, Associate Professor of Economics at SUSS. Thanks, Walter, for being on the show.
Thank you.
Now, next week, BT Correspondent will be back with another all-new episode, so please stay tuned. Do check it out. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This is a podcast by the Business Times. Find more BT podcasts at businesstimes.com.sg/podcasts. Or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is meant to provide general information only. SPH Media accepts no liability for loss arising from any reliance on the podcast or use of third parties' products and services. Please consult professional advisors for independent advice.